Dylan Woolsey. Through reading the book, there have been many times where there have been descriptions and sentiments shared, and calls to action that relate to politics today. Whether it be today's political climate or specific political movements, much of Walking with the Wind echoes on into today. For example, John Lewis stated at the time, while talking about the need for direct action, the need to, quote, raise up the rug and pull out the dirt and force people to look at it, to see it. I believe in drama. I believe in action. Lewis 180. At that time, it meant to continue to show the nation the horrors of segregation of the South and the brutality experienced by SNCC when they protested it. This has been similarly used by the modern-day Black Lives Matter protests, where it has revealed to the nation much about police brutality and systemic racism. Likewise, Lewis describes some statistics about Mississippi, where nearly 90% of Mississippi's black families live below the poverty level. The average annual income of Mississippi black families was less than $1,500, the lowest in the nation. 7% of Mississippi black students finished high school with one-sixth of the state's number of white graduates. And finally, 5% of the state's eligible black voters were registered. In many counties, there were none. 0. Lewis 182. While these statistics have gotten better since the 1960s, large racial wealth gaps still remain, and the recent Black Lives Matter protests have drawn attention to this issue as something needed to be discussed, along with other systemic issues that have racial impacts. One of these other issues is the legal system, something that Lewis also mentions in the book. He says, once again, the system was making mockery of justice. It was an echo of all the not guilty verdicts, sneeringly turned in Deep South courtrooms where white men stood trial for the blatant murders of blacks. Lewis 378. There's a major difference between then and now, being that murders today by private citizens do not get off scot-free. However, there are still immense legal disparities in the legal system on race. One of the most damaging is that evidence for potential death penalty cases is held with more value for when the defendant is black in comparison with other races. There are other legal systemic issues, from how crime is treated to how trials are prosecuted. It can be seen through all of this that there are parallels between today's issues and how our modern movements and politics try to address them by echoing the past civil rights movement that Lewis describes in his memoir. Another parallel is with the issue of structural and expression of how these protests operate. John Lewis shares a few notable remarks that connect to today's politics via the protests. For instance, he remarks in the book a few things. It was a scene that's been replayed so many times in many places, in Belfast, in Jerusalem, in Beijing, angry, desperate people hurling whatever they can at the symbols of authority, their hopeless fury more powerful than the futile bottles and bricks in their hands. The 342. Sunday now geared up for a different kind of casualty, with dozens of cases of rubbing alcohol and hundreds of boxes of band-aids for the sore muscles and blistered feet. Those 356. A riot is simply an explosion of emotion. Those 363. And where lack of jobs, intolerable housing, and police brutality, and frustrating conditions exist, it is possible that violence and mass street demonstrations may develop. Lewis 363. Each one of these relates to today. The hurling at symbols of authority is emblematic today, with people just merely throwing whatever objects they have, such as water bottles, at police. Protests need to get donations of medical supplies to help treat injuries that occur at the protests. And the nature of a riot, which is an explosion of emotion after a group of people suffer injustice and frustrating conditions for far too long, catalyzed by a single moment of immense exacerbation of those systemic injustices. Or, as another civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr. puts it, the riot is the language of the unheard. All these things that Lewis has described relate inexorably to the politics of the day by the very things he is describing, each happening many times over in the nation as people continue to protest and challenge authority after being unheard for far too long. These protests have continued throughout the summer and will continue if problems are not fixed. And as John Lewis said in the 60s, fear and deprivation form an integral part of daily life. If the government cannot answer our questions and help us solve some of these problems, I can only see many long, hot summers ahead. Lewis 364. In addition to the specific relations between the modern BLM movement and the civil rights movement in the 1960s, there are many connections to modern political ideas and sentiments throughout the book that he mentioned and discussed in the past that are relevant today in a modern political thought and climate. For instance, Lewis talks a lot about the Vietnam War and his opposition against it, saying, saying a number of things. Quote, think there's a myth, some type of fever or something, that's running wild on the American scene that gives us the idea that we are so right and that we are so powerful that we should emerge as the keeper of the world's record, as the big cop. We have a war economy, and we hate to do any serious thinking or contemplation about peacetime economy. List 380. It seems extremely contradictory to me for President Johnson to be sending tens of thousands of troops to fight this war in Vietnam to quote protect the rights of the people in South Vietnam at the same time as the rights of black people across the nation continue to be violated without protection. I had no doubt this war was hurting not just the movement but the whole of America. On a practical level, it was taking resources away from the Great Society and spending them on bombs and bullets and battles being fought around the world. This is 371. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. List 395. And that is why I stood on the floor of the House in January 1991 to oppose the Gulf War resolution. List 42. As John Lewis connected his own past of his opposition to Vietnam to his present in 1991, we can also connect the anti-war rhetoric he espoused to modern-day politics. In his first quote, Lewis condemns the cop of the world mindset that America should police the behaviors and actions of any out-of-line country with our interests, that counter our interests. This attitude is now widely held by many Americans after years of wars and interventions in the Middle East and other countries. The majority of Americans want to decrease our military presence abroad, similar to when John Lewis shared the same sentiment against intervention in regime change wars overseas. The other part of this argument is when he speaks on the level of spending directed towards the military. John Lewis speaks to this first on a practical level, where he correctly posits that by spending more on our military, more on our military budget, America spends less on social programs. He then also connects this to a moral argument, where he has stated that a country, America, spends like this is approaching a spiritual death. This is because it shows that America is more eager to wage war than provide for its citizenry at home. This view is widely held by many people today, where some politicians have even started to propose decreases to our current military budget by considerable percentages, and reallocate these funds to social services that also better align with our moral values of ensuring the common welfare of our citizenry, showing a deep connection with our modern political atmosphere concerning war and the politics of the past, with Lewis's reflections on his opposition to the war in Vietnam. Another large connection from the past to the present is in the terms of the political atmosphere concerning the view of money and political movements. Similar to how many political campaigns and representatives are now disavowing financial contributions by corporations and PACs, SNCC in the 60s also had a distrust of money. Lewis, when discussing donations to various civil rights organizations, made the following remark about SNCC's attitude towards money. Then again, there was always a current distrust about money in SNCC, along with an understanding that we needed it. There was always a concern about the strings that might be attached about control over ourselves versus control by others. Lewis 236. This concern is equally shared by those who support campaign finance reform in our modern political atmosphere, where they view political donations by corporations and wealthy individuals to hold a significant influence over our politicians through political lobbying. Both in the past and today, financial contributions are viewed as potentially corrupting influences that make politicians or political movements not adhere to their principles. When John Lewis ran for political office, he put this into practice while running his own campaign, recalling that when I ran for that city council seat, I was not beholden to anyone. I think that's what a lot of voters liked about me. They respected my sense of independence. Lewis 457. This is being repeated today in modern politics, where progressive politicians are now starting to distinguish themselves against incumbents by appealing to a similar sense of independence the SNCC adhered to in times of financial contributions. This is also emblematic of how leadership in general in the past and today is viewed. For SNCC, it was mainly against the previously more established civil rights leaders, seen in a description of the meeting where, according to John Lewis, we sat on the floor that night, Diane and Bevel and the others and I, while the elders, King, Walker, Abernathy, Fanner, sat in folding chairs. Lewis 163. This dynamic of the elders literally being higher up in authority and power was seen as not inclusive to SNCC, nor viewing the SNCC membership as equals. This is continuous to today, where in our modern politics as well. Many progressives have the view that more establishment politicians within the Democratic Party do not share the same concerns, and do not take these new congresspeople seriously and dismiss their concerns and issues similar to how SNCC members' views on leaderships, which is similar to how SNCC's members' views on leaderships were within the civil rights movement. There are a large variety of other topics that relate to our modern politics in a certain manner of ways that are mentioned or discussed throughout Lewis's recollection of the past in connection to today. These include grassroots organizing by modern campaigns, helping out their constituents directly with delivering food during the pandemic, which relates to SNCC's activities of whatever the people were doing, we were there with them. Really there. We listened, and in the process, we built up both their trust in us and their confidence in themselves. Lewis 187. Additionally, fear of red baiting by the opposition crosses through history, as it is a frequent fear of the Democratic Party. Now, along with as it is a frequent fear of the Democratic Party now, along with the past activist fear, as Lewis described, some of our people were afraid of what labels might get attached to us, List 194, and not to mention the fear of being purged with the looming threat of crackdown on radical organizations such as ourselves, that, as Foreman put it at one meeting, anyone left of center will be subject to a purge, Lewis 245. The fear of a crackdown and being purged intersects to today greatly, as if there are bills in Congress that label Antifa and left-wing activists in general as terrorists. There are some other connections between the past and present as well, when Lewis states that the president had made campaign promises specifically to the poor, and he was not following through on them, Lewis 450. And this intertwines with the president today, with many Americans feeling lied to, as their political representatives have failed to deliver change on promises that they have made. Similarly, many feel that the political parties don't represent their beliefs, as they are not implementing any policies that people today support. This was echoed decades ago in the past, with Lewis describing a common outcry: "Where is our party?" Lewis 218. This was when the belief that neither party represented the interests of Black Americans. This in a form continues on today, where growing numbers of people disapprove of both parties and are dissatisfied by both parties' governance in the White House and in Congress as well, which is reflective in the growing number of people who don't vote in elections because they feel that no matter what, their voice will not be heard. Also relating to modern politics is the policies that John Lewis supported when running for office. Quote, handing out leaflets and brochures describing my stand on specific issues, more resources and federal involvement in education in single-payer healthcare, more resources for a rapid transit system, creating jobs of course, and protecting the environment. I said it over and over that people have a right to know what's in their water, what they drink, to know what's in the water they drink, food in the food that they eat, and in the air that they breathe. Lewis 468. Similar demands of the same policies are still being fought for today by a new wave of progressives in our modern era of politics, showing a continual link from the past politics to today. John Lewis repeatedly calls for the growth of a new movement for the people. He states, for instance, after reflecting on the poverty of the cities in the North, there was a tremendous need for then, and there remains a need today, for someone to take hold of the urban centers in the North and give them a sense of direction. Lewis 207. Lewis 207. Additionally, he speaks of the need for the people, young and old alike, in these communities need to organize for a movement fueled not just by anger and rage, but by moral authority, by a sense of human righteousness fueled by the Spirit. First, however, the Spirit must be kindled within and among these communities, in these homes, in these neighborhoods, among the poor and the outcasts themselves. Lewis 488. And he also provides instructions on what to do for politics in general, saying, if those resources are not provided, if the government does not respond, then the people must remove it. Remove those elected officials from office, vote them out, replace them with people who will do what is demanded, what is needed. People are too quiet, too patient. In the great words of the 19th century civil rights fighter Frederick Douglass, we need to agitate, agitate, agitate. Lewis 49. There is hope that these statements will in fact relate to today, as modern progressive movements have started in cities like New York, Minneapolis, and Detroit, and more and more. And these people who have also come from the poor and outcasts themselves, like bartenders, principals, and nurses. There's a growing sense of the need to not just wait, and instead to enact meaningful and rapid change to improve the nation and to do what is demanded, since the government will not respond. It will be in this way that the politics shown by John Lewis in his memoir, Walking with the Wind, relate to the politics of today. There's also worry that the modern era will relate to the politics of the past in another way resembling Nashville, as John Lewis describes as an odd mix of racial progressiveness and, on the one hand, and conflict and intolerance on the other. Lewis 71. Unfortunately, just like in the past, there are people who want to return to a previous time, such as calls to, quote, make America great again. Lewis says we need to intensely combat this to ensure that the view does not come to power by saying to these people, describing in his book to, quote, ask these people if they want to go back to that time. Ask them about the values they faced that time. Ask them how valued they felt. Do we really want to go back to that? Lewis 491. I believe that John Lewis wants us to experience what he experienced when he won his congressional seat, describing the scene as the following, quote, they were out there now, holding back traffic, their smiles as broad as mine. They were out there now, and this was the best. I was walking with the wind. Lewis 479. I believe that the wind John Lewis is describing is what he refers to as the spirit of history, with the people all behind a popular movement to advance justice, freedom, and well-being for all people, not just the United States, but around the world. In this way, the legacy of John Lewis and his politics lives on to today, as we continue to fight for this better world to emerge and build the beloved community around the globe.